Sometimes we know that we are to obey the Lord, we're to speak out and be bold, and yet, nonetheless, we are afraid. So we need to understand, where does this fear come from, and how do we mute it so that we can obey what the Lord is calling us to do. So in the previous episode, I shared lightly that at one point in my early 20s, I had been kidnapped by human traffickers in Belize. I didn't go into a lot of detail with it in that episode, but in this episode, I want to share a little bit more, because this is the story that helped me overcome my fear of speaking out. And there, I believe, is a really good lesson in it for everyone to help them learn how to overcome their fear of speaking publicly and speaking out about vulnerable things and vulnerable topics. So, as I shared in the previous episode, this event had happened in my early 20s. I was married at the time, which I am no longer with this person, but they had been traveling in the military to these South American countries, and I wanted to go with them on their next trip because they went to so many nice places and they had a lot of free time when they were there doing really nice things, and I wanted to be a part of this. So the next place my husband went was Belize, and so we went there, but he went and stayed on base, which I could have stayed with him. I don't know why that didn't work out that way, but nonetheless, he put me in a hostel in the jungle, which just for a couple more dollars a night, I could have stayed in a nice civilized area, but I don't know why he chose to put me there. I have some opinions and ideas about that nowadays, but nonetheless, that's where I was. It was literally deep in the jungle, and the only way to get to the civilized area was to take a taxi. So the plan was every day I would just take a taxi to the civilized area, meaning the populated area, and I would just stay in the touristy areas until my husband got off work. Well, I went downstairs to take a cab. I was dressed in cut-off shorts and a cotton shirt over my two-piece bathing suit at the time, which I used to dress like that. And the lady at the front desk, which was really just a lady standing outside in the front of the house, looked me up and down and said, "No, you can't go like this. You have to cover everything up." And I didn't understand, because it would have been like a 15-minute drive and I would have been at the beach area. So what's wrong with that? And she said, "You don't understand, in Belize, every man is a cab driver if he likes what he sees." And she's like, "So you have to cover everything." And I was like, "I don't understand. How do you mean that every man is a cab driver?" And she said, "Well, every man can go get a green plate, which makes you a cab driver. And if they like what they see, they go put the green plate on the back of their car, and then they come pick you up." So I went and covered up the best I could. When I came down, she didn't seem very happy with it, but it was the best I had. I was like, "How do I get a cab?" She's like, "You just walk to the edge of the street," which was like a sandy dirt road in the middle of the jungle. So I walked to the edge of the street, and all these cabs pulled up, like 7 or 8 of them pulled straight out of the jungle. I don't even know how they knew I was there. It was kind of strange. And I turned back to look at her to kind of get a cue of like, which one do I go with? Because there were so many, and she was gone. So I just picked one, and I told them I wanted to go to the hotel that we were heading to. He did not take me to the hotel. Instead, he took me deep into another side of the jungle, and there was a huge clearing, and there was all these men, and they were partying around this huge bonfire drinking, and I was the only female. And I knew I was in trouble. I just didn't know how to get out of the trouble. I also felt myself shutting down, and I think that was because of things I'd gone through in my past, because I had been assaulted and abused in my past. My natural instinct was just shut down, and that's how you protect yourself. You just don't exist in this moment anymore. And that's what was happening. But then this other car came peeling down the road and literally skidded sideways. And the guy leaned over and threw open his car door and was like, "Get in." And I thought, well, he's the one guy compared to all these guys. He could be a worse guy, but I don't know. At least I'll be moving in a car away from these guys. So I jumped in with him and we began driving. He was speeding out of that jungle area. Those guys were throwing beer bottles at us and yelling. And as we're driving, he's like, "Where do you want to go?" I told him the hotel I wanted to go to. And I'm thinking in my head, I don't even know if he's going to take me there. But I don't even want to ask him, which is weird, right? I don't even want to ask him because I'm afraid he's going to tell me no. So this is like that shutdown process. I'm already shutting down and I'm not asking important things that I should ask because I'm too afraid to know the answer. And I don't know how to handle the answer if it's what I'm afraid it is, that he's just another bad guy, basically. So I'm just sitting there until he pulls me up front to the hotel. And then he says to me, "Hun, do you not understand what just happened?" And that's the first time I turned and looked at him. And he was an older gentleman. He had like dark Belizean skin. And he had this shocking white hair on his head, like a whole poof of shocking white hair. And I said, "No." And he said, "Those are human traffickers. They're famous around here for hunting down tourists. They would have their way with you. And if you lived, then they would have taken you to the docks where they would have sold you into human trafficking." He said, "Our ports are some of the biggest human trafficking ports in South America." So I was freaked out, but I was still in so much shock. He gave me a card. He's like, "How long are you going to be here? You just call me every time." I got out of the car and fell to the ground. As I told in the previous episode, when I tried sharing it with my husband, he just laughed it off and said I was exaggerating and making things up. And because he laughed it off as nothing, part of my shutdown process accepted that and just shut it all down. And I didn't speak about it again for nearly 20 years. And finally, one day, I was talking to a friend of mine, and she was telling me about an event she was running and that it was going to be sponsored by this anti-human trafficking ministry. And I said, I've heard that word before. I think I was almost human trafficked once." And she said, "What do you mean you think you were?" And I said, "Well," and for the first time since that situation, almost 20 years later, I told her the whole story. The first human I ever spoke the whole story. I was shaking like a leaf and crying, and this fear was just washing over me wave after wave because it felt so raw and vulnerable to share this story when my husband had laughed at me about it and laughed it off as a joke. Like it was nothing. It wasn't a big deal. And it was a big deal. It was a terrifying experience in my life. But all the things that had happened to me bad in my life, I'd been taught to be quiet, not talk. You only stir up and cause a problem by saying stuff about it. So just don't say things. Through my marriage, it was the same thing. Like just my whole life, it was always just don't cause problems. Don't make waves. And so that's what would keep me silent. On top of that, I think it was also part of that shutdown process. So I would receive it and not fight it because it was how I would just shut down and deal with it. Besides, I mean, if you think through that stuff, you'll start thinking everybody's against you. Right? But she wanted me to speak at her event after I shared that story with her. And I was like, no way. That's my biggest fear in the whole world is public speaking. And she said, "Well, I will email you all the details because you need to be speaking at this event." And I did not know how to tell her no because I didn't have very good boundaries at the time. So long story short, I got suckered into it in a sense, but I think it was a very good thing. But at the time, I didn't. I was terrified. And I had created a slide deck. I had looked up online how to do that. I created like 60 some slides. And basically, I had written my whole story on the slides, and I figured I would just use a clicker and I would read my story from the slides. And I was like, who cares what anybody thinks? At least I won't freeze up and lose my words and not know what to say and be left stammering, basically. So I got to the event, and the media lady took my thumb drive with my slides. And when she saw all the slides, she's like, oh, honey, she's like, I just want to let you know there's no clicker. We don't have one here. I do the slides. So how do you want to do this? And I was like, great. I was like, well, I've never done this before and I'm terrified. And I'm just going to read everything from the slides. And she's like, I will just follow along with you and I'll click. And if I don't click at the right spot, you just turn and look at me and I'll click for you. And she didn't even question it. She didn't even say that's not how you do it or that's ridiculous. She just went right along so lovingly. And that had such an impact on me that she was just so sweet about that. And I mean, that was actually really huge to me that she responded the way she did. I mean, to this day, that woman doesn't know what a blessing that was, that she just responded with such kindness without any accusatory judgment toward my ridiculous speaking process. But I had also made printed out papers that were set on everybody's seats before the beginning of the little conference. It was a mother-daughter conference, and there was, I don't know, maybe a couple hundred people in the room or less. But for me, it was a massive crowd. And there was a bunch of speakers, and they were all amazing. I mean, I think like 3 or 4 maybe went before me. They were so good, and I'm sitting there just sweating. Like, I just want this to be over. As soon as this is over, it's going to be amazing. And there was like a little shop in the back of the event where the girls could walk around all these tables and look at and shop for things and look at things. And so people were doing that even while the speakers were talking, which that made me a little more comfortable because I thought, okay, they'll do that. I won't feel like every eye in the room is on me, which was really terrifying to think about. Then I stood up and I opened with, when I was 28 years old, I was kidnapped in Belize. And boom, the whole room went dead quiet, which I don't know how I didn't figure that. I just didn't, because I was so afraid. And I didn't even plan like trying to make a catchy opening. That's just kind of how I started. But I had a rap audience. And so I was really reading from the slides. I don't think I did good in the sense of public speaking, but at the same time, when it was all done, I actually had planned to have a little bit of a Q&A at the end, and I ran out of time. And the host came up to me and she's like, hey, I know lunch is supposed to be next. I know you were so nervous about this, but there's actually a line of women and girls who want to talk to you. Would you be willing to go talk to them? And I was like, okay. So I went, and they started coming up from a 14-year-old girl to a 60-some-year-old woman and all those in between, mothers and daughters. And they all had stories of a time when they had been kidnapped or almost kidnapped kind of scenarios. I mean, one little girl literally had me read it off her phone because she was actually currently under a gag order because of what was going on, and she wasn't allowed to speak aloud about it. And she was encouraged by my story because she was feeling suicidally depressed because she had fallen for a catfishing scheme, and thankfully it had got stopped. But she just felt so ashamed that she fell for it, which was a huge thing that I was talking about being kidnapped at around 28 years old, because I felt so ashamed that I did. Like, how stupid am I? How do you get kidnapped when you're older? But there's kidnappers want you for all different reasons and for all different ages and sex and everything else. It's not that, but it's just that lie of the enemy immediately. Like, you just got victimized and your first reaction is shame. Why? And for me, it didn't help that my husband at the time was mocking me and disbelieving me and what I was sharing with him. But nonetheless, you feel bad, you feel stupid, you feel like somehow you caused the situation. And that's what this girl had been feeling. But when she said, when I stood up there and shared what I shared, she suddenly knew what she was going to do when the whole court process was over, that she was going to stand up and speak out and share her story. And she had this hope because of that. And that blew my mind. And suddenly, like, I saw something that I was so stuck in this bubble of fear, of speaking, of, I don't know, whatever it was that was making me afraid of what people might think when I speak, when really my story, that testimony of what I had been through and escaped and how I came out of it and what was being birthed through the process of it, had an impact on others that actually made a difference in their lives. And when that connected with me and I began to see and realize the power of my testimony, that when it's shared with somebody else, it can set somebody else free. I left there in such a strange state of mind, because I left there thinking, I kind of felt a little bit high and giddy and in awe, because I couldn't believe this experience that I was so terrified of had had such an impact. And then a few months later, I was invited to speak somewhere else for something else. And I thought, oh, I'm going to have all this fear and anxiety and I'm going to be so nervous. And I got up there and there was like no fear. And I thought, what happened? What happened to all the fear? Where did it go? And I realized I don't care about what anybody else thinks about me when I'm speaking. If I'm sweating, if I'm stuttering, if I mess up my words, that's not the point. That's not what's important. What's important is the message, the testimony that is being shared with the specific audience that I'm speaking to, because it can have impact in their lives to give them hope, to give them purpose, to give them direction. And once I realized that, that's what took the fear away. That's what took the fear. That's what helped me overcome the fear to speak out, to be able to speak publicly, because it was no more about myself. It was about who I was speaking to when I spoke and what it could do for them, the transformation they could have from listening. And so that is why I shared this with you, because I really want to encourage you. That's why I've been sharing in the last couple episodes of practicing sharing parts of your story, finding someone to speak it to, speaking out parts and pieces of it, whatever parts and pieces you can comfortably share as your first step, because then you're going to begin to see the results of the power of your testimony. I want to say, what's holding you back from sharing your story? Ask yourself that. But in a sense, I asked myself that all the time. Why am I so afraid? Why am I so afraid of public speaking? Why do I don't think I care about what anybody thinks about me. In a sense, I did not care what anybody thought about me anyway. But in a sense, I did, obviously, because I think it wasn't that I was worried what people were going to say about how I spoke or what people were going to say about what I looked like, but I was concerned that I didn't have anything of value to share. There it is. I think that's the first time I just understood that. That's what it was. I was afraid that what I had to say wasn't valuable enough to make a difference. It wasn't important enough. It didn't have enough weight. It wasn't a big enough story to make a difference. I mean, honestly, when I was to share that story of what happened to me in Belize, I thought, well, stupid. I wasn't really trafficked. I got saved. So who cares? There's other people out there who are getting trafficked and they have more important stories. And that's what I thought. That was the lie. That was the trap that the enemy was setting for me, to keep my mouth shut and not talk about it. Because your story is not as powerful as somebody else's. That is such a lie. Every one of us have a story that's powerful. It doesn't matter if it's quote unquote big or quote unquote small. What matters is that we don't let the devil silence us from sharing the miracles, the transformations, the revelation, the awesomeness of God in our life and in our circumstances. I truly believe that man who came and saved me was an angel unaware. I really do. Because I never saw him again. I didn't try calling him because I was way too terrified after that. I wouldn't go anywhere unless my husband and the Marines came and picked me up in the van they were traveling in. But I really believe the Lord sent an angel to save me. But I also felt guilty about that because I thought, why would the Lord send an angel to save me and not somebody else when so many people are in trouble and the Lord's not saving them? Now, I will say I have been through things where no angels showed up to save me and horrible things happened to me. So I have gone through those things and there was none of that. So sometimes there is, sometimes there's not. I don't know why. I just know that was part of that testimony. And I know that the lie the enemy was keeping me silent with was that my story didn't matter. My story wasn't powerful enough. My story wouldn't have impact enough. My story wasn't important enough. So that's what I want to say to look at when I say what's holding you back from sharing your story, your testimony, your message. Really check that with yourself because you might say it is what you look like and sounds like. Some people really wrestle with that. And at some point actually, after I had spoken a few times, I started getting into podcasting. Suddenly, I started having really big insecurities about my voice because I heard my voice on a microphone for the first time and I did not like it. But those are just ridiculous things to get caught up about when the message and transformational promise for others is so big if we would speak out. And that's what we have to remember. That's what matters. So I want to encourage you to, if you haven't already, to memorize Revelations 12:11 that says, by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimonies, they overcame him, loving not their lives unto death. Post that up on sticky notes everywhere. Remind yourself of it. Memorize it. Hide it in your heart because your message, your testimony is powerful enough to slay the enemy according to the word of God.